I think we need to talk about this watch. So I know this is really weird and I felt unsure about whether or not to do a video on it, but I got very curious when I first saw it and I had tons of questions about it. So I thought I'm surely not the only one with questions like, who makes them? Why are they being made? And was this always a thing? Is this a weird inside joke only a few people understand? And isn't this sort of a taboo? Or I mean, should this be a taboo? So after doing my research, I found some very interesting answers to my questions that I want to share with you. And by the end of this video, I am sure you'll come to a different point of view on these sort of watch dials. So first, I was wondering where these kinds of watches come from. I mean, who started with these images on watch dials? Has this always been a thing? And if so, is there some sort of starting point in the history of watchmaking? And how come most of these watches don't even tell the time anyways? And I did some digging and the answer to that question is more simple than I thought, and it all starts with understanding how the capability of keeping and telling time had an impact on society in general. So back then, and I'm talking about the 17th to the 18th century here, the keeping and telling of time wasn't for everybody. When you were a farmer, for example, there wasn't this intricate concept of time for you. You'd always work until you took a break for festivities or to wait for another task or duty to begin. There wasn't a timely set end of your workday. But when the middle class started to emerge, the bourgeoisie, which only got accelerated by the European industrialization in the late 18th century, those people started to earn more money, and money they could not only spend on necessities, but also money to indulge in luxuries such as status symbols. One of these symbols happens to be watches, because keeping track of your time or having some place to be at a certain time simply meant that you were important. But those middle-class people would never think of buying watches with such a dial, given that it's not only super expensive due to the material and labor that went into it, but also because telling the time with these watches was only secondary given its obvious design. It was not geared towards functionality. So for what kind of people were these watches actually made? As I said, watches were a status symbol for the middle class, so in order to set them even more apart, really rich people, aka the nobility, had to obviously one-up them by having their pocket watches or clocks decorated with precious gemstones or made from precious materials, etc. As such decorations are art, and we know that art has always encompassed everything from religious depictions to mundane things, stories, fantasies, gory things sometimes, and also erotic depictions. It shouldn't come as a surprise that erotic motifs sooner or later ended up on watches too. So at the peak of that specific business from circa 1750 to 1850, those watches made their way through the vast network of trading routes with the help of English businessmen who fulfilled the orders commissioned mostly by extremely wealthy people from China or India. Unsurprisingly, those watch dials and parts were crafted where regular watches were made too, so I'm looking at you, Switzerland. But that only explains their physical origin to some extent. I was also wondering about how watches like that started to take off given the society and their norms and taboos back then. How come such pieces became more and more popular among the high society? Well, I found a surprisingly wholesome answer to that. Erotic watches are simply a stand-in for the zeitgeist of that time period. Because for this time frame, we are looking at the Rococo period or late Baroque, a time that was exceptionally ornamental and theatrical in its style of art and decoration or architecture, which was very prevalent, especially in Central Europe. And don't forget, this was also the time of the womanizer in history, Giacomo Casanova. So the oversimplified answer to the question whether these watches come from is that art has always been depicting all sorts of motifs, including erotic ones, and with the rise of pocket watches and their status within society, it was only normal for these things to be adorned with art, which lead to erotic art. And as always, supply always follows demand, and as humans have always been, well, human, we shouldn't be surprised to find these motifs either. Okay, so now we know where they come from and what prompted watchmakers and dial artists to create all sorts of not safe for work content. But are these watches all the same? I was wondering whether or not this is a case of you see one and you have seen them all, or if there might be more to them. And so here's what I found out. Generally, they're being divided into two categories: erotic and pornographic. Erotic watches are mostly just alluding to things, depicting certain fantasies while leaving just enough to the viewer's imagination. For example, having certain things covered up simply by clothes or just certain watch parts. Pornographic watches are clearly meant to arouse. They depict explicit acts, sometimes just in pictures or using automatons to really illustrate it. This Ulysse is clearly a pornographic watch. I mean, obviously, it is up to the person whether or not they find something belonging to the first or second category. I mean, whatever floats your boat, you know. But that should enable you to roughly distinguish watches within this subgenre. The Ulysse Nardin here is a minute repeater, also known as a voyeur, given the motif you can see on the dial, but we'll get to that in a minute. It is made from 18 karat rose gold, has a diameter of 42 millimeters with rather thick lugs that run straight to the black alligator strap. Ulysse Nardin has used their in-house hand-wound caliber, how fitting, the UN-73 with a power reserve of circa 36 hours. It is a minute repeater timepiece with automated jacquemins on the dials, which describes an automaton, so a mechanized figure or person, which usually strikes a bell with a hammer. So you can actually hear the time with this one and not only see it. The first dong represents the hour, the second ding dong stands for the quarter minutes, and the last ding stands for just the minutes. So let's hear what 10:59 would sound like. So now that we have talked about the theory, let's get to the practical part. As you can clearly see here on the dial, there are a total of 4 people involved in this scene, so let's dissect the dial. Making up almost 2/3 of the entire dial, we have the couple on the right-hand side, which are also the reason for the name of this watch. Hiding behind a heavy curtain, the man in front slightly pulls back the fabric to reveal the sight of another couple, as well as a beautifully upholstered bench and the rest of the what looks like very fancy room. If you take a closer look to the details, you can see a high window in the back with a glass design that is typical for older buildings, as well as the beautiful pattern of dark and light tiles and a very precious looking carpet at the forefront. These details let us know that this scene is not set in some random place. It gives you a sense of luxury, a place with a lavish interior, and I do not think the resemblance to all things Rococo is accidental here at all. What's also interesting to note is that compared to much older erotic watches, it's not always the woman playing the passive part. On this dial, it is the female on the right side that plays an active role, given the automation that is her arm. The couple on the left-hand side portrays an active man, which creates a balance within the theme of this watch. I'm sure you would have guessed by now that this was all done entirely by hand. And whether you like the motif or not, you cannot deny how absolutely incredible the work on this dial is. The fine details are insane, and I think my favorite part is probably the shading on the cushioned part of the sofa. So now that we know where it comes from, how it looks, and where the nuances lie, there's still a question left that made me super uncomfortable to talk about this watch in the first place. Is there more to it than just the obvious? And if so, what is it? Well, as I was reading more and more about the story of erotic watches and how they came about, I stumbled upon a sentence that really did change my mind about the watches and ultimately convinced me to do this video. Those watches are meant to please and not provoke. And that's when it dawned on me. These watches made me feel uncomfortable before because I did not understand their context. When they started with these watches, they were not meant to be seen by eyes other than their owners and perhaps some close friends or, I don't know, lovers? My first reaction was to be offended by something so explicit, but it's actually the watch that should be offended because I stared at it. Those motifs are all about a personal fantasy. They were commissioned by a person. They wished for a hidden or private little fantasy they could indulge in away from judging eyes. And when you look at the different depictions and motifs on older watches, you see how most of them depict scenes in very utopian-like surroundings. There's waterfalls and forests and other stunning landscapes. It's a world free of judgment, constrictions, or jealousy. It's really free-spirited and unobstructed. I think it's fair to say that this kind of watch art offered some sort of escapism. In a time where freedom of expression wasn't a thing, you had to start to get inventive, I guess. I know, it might sound a bit too over the top or too deep, but I'm sure you can all understand the motivation here to a certain extent. Plus, you should never underestimate the power of boredom. These rich people were as free as you could be back then. In their world where money could buy you almost everything, it must have been thrilling to push the limits for a bit every now and then. Even if to us it's just a watch with a ding-dong on it, and in case of the listener, quite literally. And so here you have it. Erotic watches, as uncomfortable as they might make you feel, have a valid right to exist. Though they are a tiny subgenre of watches, they tell us a great deal about how watches were used to not only tell the time, but to tell stories, even naughty ones. The only reason some might feel offended by them at first is because we have taken them out of their initial context. They are not meant to be displayed in front of a big audience. They are to be enjoyed in private, same as the things you see depicted on them, I guess. I get that I have now done the complete opposite by making a video about it, but I still think it is necessary because there's more to these watches than just their shock value. What is also a bit funny is that I couldn't even find that much info on this watch on the Ulyssnadr website, and it seems like they themselves are a bit unsure about this watch too. And so now this marks the end of this video. Have I changed your mind about these watches? And if so, what do you think about them now? As always, if you have enjoyed this video, make sure to give it a thumbs up. And if you would like to see more videos like this, you can subscribe to my channel, and I will see you in my next one. Bye.